So during my time in the hobby, I have amassed a pretty substantial collection of books, and at the rate that I have been reading them, I will get through them all maybe before I die. But with this global pandemic that's happening right now and this quarantine situation that I currently find myself in, I figured, what better time to share with you all some of the books that I've collected over the years. So the first book I have in this pile over here to my right is called After Yorktown by Don Glickstein. Ask an average person on the street what the last battle of the American Revolution was, and they'll probably say Yorktown, which is not technically true. Yes, while Yorktown did represent the official surrender of the British Army in North America, the war itself officially kept going until 1783. The peace treaty wasn't signed until 1783. So between 1781 and 1783, you still have the entire year of 1782 to contend with, in which Patriot and Loyalist forces were continuing to skirmish back and forth with each other. Not to mention you also had the British and French navies facing off against each other in the Caribbean, and as well the British and French armies fighting each other in other parts of the world. Once the French joined the war on the American side, it effectively was no longer a war just against the Americans, but against the French as well. And so the French continued to attack British-held territories in places like India. So if you want to get technical, the last battle of the American Revolution isn't in America at all, it's in India. And so this book covers all of that in great detail. And it really is a pretty fascinating read. Oh, and also, it's not like the British immediately packed up all their bags and went home as soon as Yorktown had concluded. No, they stuck around for a little while. They were still garrisoned in places like Charlestown in South Carolina. And they were sort of watching the Americans, and they weren't really sure what they were going to do. The Americans were sort of watching them, not really sure what they were going to do, but neither side really had the ability to do anything at that point. They were pretty strung out. There are some passages in here that really describe just how much of a bad way both sides were in by the end of the war. If I can find one of them. We have a passage at the top of page 46 here, which is from the diary of General William Moultrie, an American general, who says that he was struck by just the absence of animals and the devastation that had been wrought by the war. He says, "Not the vestiges of horses, cattle, hogs, or deer were to be found. The squirrels and birds of every kind were totally destroyed. No living creature was to be seen except now and then a few buzzards picking the bones of some unfortunate fellows who had been shot or cut down and left in the woods above the ground." So yeah, some pretty grisly imagery in here. Really fascinating read, especially if you're looking for something that covers the later years of the war, which are often forgotten. So the next book we have here is British Army Uniforms from 1751 to 1783 by Carl Franklin. This is sort of just a comprehensive list of all of the regiments that were in the British Army from the mid to late 18th century. And it just sort of gives an illustrated reference of what all of their uniforms would have looked like, or more or less. So this is what it looks like. They all kind of, each page looks like this. Let me see if I can find yeah, here we are. This is the page that talks about the uniforms of the 54th and how they would have evolved over the course of the mid to late 18th century. So I would say this is a very good starting reference point for if you're a reenactor and you're thinking of starting up a new impression that hasn't been attempted before. I wouldn't use this as your only reference, because it does get a few things wrong here and there. For instance, if I can find a regiment that has red facings, yes. The NCO sash, it says it's just illustrated as just a plain red sash, which would make it easy to mistake for an officer's sash. So what it misses is that any regiment that had red facings, there would have been a white stripe going through the middle. So yeah, there's that. Next up, we have From Redcoat to Rebel, the Thomas Sullivan Journal. This is the journal of a British soldier who fought in the 49th Regiment and eventually deserted, joined the American Army, moved to Philadelphia, and then remained here after the end of the war and started a family. The author, Thomas Sullivan, I would say, well, let's just say he's not going to win any Pulitzer Prizes anytime soon. The writing is a little bit dry, and he doesn't get into any of the personal details about his experiences quite as much as I would perhaps like him to. However, what is interesting about this particular account is the fact that he takes extensive notes about just the order of battle in all of the engagements that he was in. He takes notes on the casualty reports, and he also just took note of other things, just like his rations, what he was given, what they consisted of, how much he was given. And in fact, he also at one point talks a little bit about the value of English coin in relation to other currencies of the day. So this is an interesting reference if you're looking for information on things like that. If you're looking for specific stories about British soldiers and the trials and tribulations that they went through, there's perhaps some better books on that subject that we will get to later. Next up, we have The British Are Coming by Rick Atkinson. This is a fairly recent publication, and it's another one of those books that just sort of gives an overview of the entire War of Independence from start to finish. So it's not particularly unique in that regard. However, what I do appreciate about this book in particular is just the way that it really sets the scene for you. It really does a good job of placing you in the moment, describing just the sights, the sounds, the smells even of some of these historic locations during these historic events. So I'll read a little passage for you here. This is from one of the early chapters where the British are on the march to Lexington and Concord. Few knew their destination. 2 a.m. had come and gone as they put on speed. With their wet shoes squelching at more than 100 steps per minute, their pace approached 4 miles an hour. Past apple and plum orchards they tramped, past smokehouses and cider mills and oblique driftways that led into cow pastures. The heavy footfall rattled pewter dishes on dressers and in cupboards, and an 8-year-old boy, awake when he should have been sleeping, later recalled a wondrous sight on the road outside his window, a long, bobbing column of red, like a flowing river, sweeping northwest beneath a gibbous moon. So just really, really well illustrated, I think. And next up, we have a classic. Some of you might be familiar with this one already. With Zeal and with Bayonets Only by Matthew Spring. This is pretty much the definitive book to read for anybody interested in the way that the British Army operated in North America during the American War of Independence. One of the most prevalent myths that we encounter as people who portray British soldiers when we're dealing with the general public is that the British were stupid and they were inflexible and didn't know how to adapt to the North American terrain because they were accustomed to fighting in open fields and they just could not conceive of the fact that the rebels were shooting at them from behind trees. And so that inflexibility is ultimately what lost them the war. And this book just takes that myth and dashes it into pieces by illustrating that, in fact, the British were highly adaptable. It talks a lot about just the grand overall strategy that they employed and how that evolved over the course of the war. It talks about how the army functioned on both a battalion, a regimental, and a company level. And eventually it just gets into some of the general thoughts and sentiments that the British soldiers had about the American rebels. Spoiler alert, they didn't like them very much. So yeah, very good book. Cannot recommend it enough, especially if you are interested in getting into Revolutionary War reenacting, and especially if you are getting into the British side. So these next few books I actually don't have physical copies of. I have them as ebooks. And the first one that I would like to call your attention to is one that I have talked about on this channel before, British Soldiers' American War by Don Hagest. I spoke a little bit before about the Thomas Sullivan Journal and how in that book he didn't really get as much into the details of his personal life as much as I would have liked him to. This is just a collection of writings from British soldiers who actually do go into great detail about their day-to-day lives in the army and their thoughts and opinions on what was happening around them. In particular, I am drawn to the first account that Don calls attention to in this book, which is the account of John Robert Shaw, who fought in the 33rd Regiment. And his story, I think, is just incredibly compelling and interesting. He joined the Army when he was about 15 or 16, came over to fight in the American Revolution, witnessed some pretty harrowing stuff, developed an alcohol problem very early on, eventually deserted right before the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, where he was captured by the Americans and then brought to a prison camp in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he remained for a little while before escaping. And then he basically just tried to live out a nice, quiet life for himself, uninterrupted by the war, doing various odd jobs, but not being particularly good at any of them. And eventually, he re-enlisted in the American Army and served as an American soldier for the last few months of the war. And then, once the war was over, settled in America and had several wives, several children, eventually moved to Kentucky and became a well digger, where eventually, in I think about 1813 or so, he blew himself up. So, yeah, quite a life this guy had. And finally, the last book that I have on my list that I would like to share with you all is called Dangerous Guests by Ken Miller. I mentioned briefly that John Robert Shaw, after he was captured by the Americans, was sent to a prison camp in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This book is all about that camp, how it was founded, the difficulties that the Americans had in housing the prisoners, what conditions in the prison were like, and just the effect that the presence of those prisoners had on the townspeople. And it's just very interesting subject matter because both sides during the American Revolution really struggled with how to house their prisoners. Obviously, the British, in most instances, resorted to using prison ships. The Americans didn't necessarily have that option available to them. So one of the options that they settled on was taking their prisoners and moving them to some place far away from the lines where they could not be recaptured by the enemy. And it gets into great detail just talking about how woefully underprepared the people of Lancaster were to deal with such a sudden influx of prisoners coming into this old barracks that they had repurposed. It talks about the multiple escape attempts that happened with various levels of complexity and success. Yeah, just a really interesting insight into the dynamic between the presence of these prisoners and the local population. So that was just a small sample of some of the readings that I've amassed over the years. I do hope that you found it all interesting. I will, of course, provide links in the description to all of these readings in case you want to check them out for yourselves. Until next time, guys, take it easy, stay safe, God save the king.